And then we looked at the red horse, which stands for war. And we're going to look at the black horse, and then the pale, sickly-looking green horse. Revelation chapter 6, starting in verse 5. When he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, "Come and see." And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, "A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." When he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, I am so thankful that by the time we get to this section of your word, that we will no longer be here. Because in your mercy and grace you have come to rapture the church and remove it. But at the same time, every time I read about these judgments, my heart gets heavy because the unsaved are going to endure just horrible things, which are totally deserving because of the heinous sin that they have committed against you. But help us while we still have time to realize and lift up our eyes and see that the harvest is truly white and ready. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. It starts out here with the third seal, the parallel passages, Matthew 24, verse 7, Mark 13:8, and Luke 21:11. Talk about this third seal. You have black horse, which stands for famine. And again, I won't give you the correlation of the beasts. I'm not sure, because the Bible really doesn't say that this is the order in which they told him to come and see. It could have been any of the horses that did it, but if you're going by the order of the beasts given to us earlier, we see that the third beast would be man, and he stands for reason. And you're going to see the failure of man's reason when you see the huge famine that takes place here. There are some very important symbols, and every time we look at these 4 horses and their riders, we look at the symbols and then we look at the meaning. The symbol black always stands for distress, calamity, and quite frequently famine. It doesn't have to stand for famine, but we know in this case that it is famine by the following verse. If we just had verse 5, we wouldn't know that it was famine, because throughout the Bible it could be anything. It's interesting here that he is going forth with a balance. And we'll get into that more later. But the same term is used for the main beam of an ox yoke. So it means to be yoked to something. And in this case, it means distress and calamity. I want to show you a couple of verses, just so you realize that that this is part of God's Word, and he uses it fairly frequently. And so you remember, this whole letter is being written to churches that are being persecuted, and it's meant to be an encouragement to them. A persecution is going to happen until the end times. And tonight, you're going to see, by the time we get done with the 4th horse, you're going to see that man's decisions have consequences. And then there's more choices and decisions that have more consequences. And that's what happens as you move through these 4 horsemen. Lamentations 5:10. In Lamentations 5:10, we have an interesting phrase. I was this many years old before I realized that the Bible referred to this as much as it does. Lamentations 5:10, let me read it for you. Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. I was a little bit surprised. I found quite a few verses. We're only going to look at a few of them tonight that talk about being black-faced because of dire calamity and famine. Joel 2:6. I'll read that for you. before their face, the people shall be much pained. All faces shall gather blackness. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to be out in the sun for too long. It means they're going to have the look of a certain countenance because of what has happened to them for a prolonged period of time. Nahum chapter 2 and verse 10. Very similar. She is empty and void and waste, and the heart melteth, and the knees smite together, and much pain is in all loins, and the faces of them all gather blackness. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read a verse like that, you can tell if somebody is in wicked torment. When you think about their heart melting, there is no strength, there is no hope, there is no inner fortitude, there is no will to keep going on. Over and over and over again, that's what the Bible talks about when it talks about the heart melting. There just isn't any desire to go on anymore. And to be in pain and to have your joints smiting together, terrible weakness and awful fear. The face is gathering blackness. That is an ominous prediction that can't hold out under these circumstances much longer. Jeremiah 14:2. Judah mourneth, and the gates thereof languish, strong term. They are black under the ground, and the cry of Jerusalem is gone up. So over and over and over again, in periods when God's judgment is the strongest upon the nation of Israel, he uses this figure of having a black face from circumstances that we just have a hard time thinking how long and drawn out and dire they really are. So can you imagine all the Jewish people that were in the church and they were reading this section, and he says there's a black horse that goes out, and everybody would have just drawn their breath and thought, you've got to be kidding me. Very, very serious picture. We also see that as this rider goes forth, he's carrying balances in his hand. Now, balances can be symbolic of a couple of different things. In our day today, they are usually symbolic of justice. And we see that quite a bit above most of our courthouses. Probably supposed to be an angel or a Lady Liberty or something standing there holding a sword and balances. And the picture is supposed to be that they are going to weigh the truth, and then there is going to be justice that comes forth. And then if any punishment must be meted out because of the justice, then, the sword is ready. Well, that founding, obviously, because of the founding fathers, is very biblical. And go with me, if you will, to Job chapter 31. Job chapter 31. And in verse 6. This is towards the end of a long, drawn-out ordeal for Job. And over and over again, his friends have been accusing him of wrongdoing. He says, let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know mine integrity. He said, listen, I'm not afraid of the justice of God. I stand before him all the time. I have a great relationship with him, and I have no problem being weighed in his balances to see whether my integrity is right or not. Psalm 62, verse 9. Surely men of low degree are vanity or emptiness, and men of high degree are a lie. To be laid in the balance, they are altogether lighter than vanity. And so what he's saying is, while we judge certain folks and say you have men of low degree or you have men of high degree, God says when you throw either one of those in the balance of truth, you come up with nothing. The other thing that the Bible uses the scales for, instead of being justice and weighing out according to his law, they're used for weighing out things of great value. And it's important because you want a very accurate and you want a very careful weighing. And that happens under two circumstances. One, you are either weighing something that is extremely precious, and so a mistake either way is going to cost somebody. If you're weighing out gold, you want to have a reliable weight. The buyer or the seller is going to lose out if the weight isn't accurate when you're talking about buying something that's as precious as gold, which is, $1,200 an ounce or something ridiculous right now. And just think about how a tenth of an ounce, how much value you would gain or lose if the weight wasn't accurate. But what's more interesting is the Bible spends a lot more time talking about the second aspect of that, and that's weighing out things that are valuable because of their scarcity. And most often it talks about either wheat or barley or bread. And most of the times when it talks about that, it is in a form of punishment from God. Now, verse 6 tells us this proclamation. It tells us what the scales mean. It tells us it's not a justice thing. It tells us that he is measuring out the wheat and the barley. And so we are left with this situation where we know that these folks are in dire straits. It's going to be awful. We'll get to it in just a minute. The meaning, what's the big deal here? What God is doing is he is stacking block upon block upon block. After you have this red horse come out that is war, you have famine. Famine often follows war, and we discussed this last week when we talked about the red horse. Harsh conditions are often left behind after an army has come in. You have farmers that have been killed, you have fields that have been destroyed, sometimes you have resources that are either been consumed or wasted. If you come in and you beat somebody and they have barns that have their grain in it or their hay in it or whatever, and you want to leave a lasting impression on them, you simply burn it to the ground. You take what you need and then you burn it so that they can't enjoy it. And after you leave, the people that are left behind are left with what? It's not like they can go out and plant again and hope to get another growing season in before the harsh conditions of winter or the rainy season come. And so it's a picture of how cold and cruel the long-term effects of war can really be. A couple of verses to show you this link. Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 4. I thought about studying Jeremiah. It's a long book. I don't know if we ever did it. They shall die of grievous deaths. They shall not be lamented, neither shall they be buried, but they shall be as dung upon the face of the earth. And they shall be consumed by the sword and by famine. And their carcasses shall be meat for the fowls of heaven and for the beasts of the earth. And this is a picture of so many bodies laying out there that you can't possibly bury them. They just leave them laying like when cows have gone through and left dung piles laying all over the ground. Have you ever seen any of the pictures of the Civil War when the battle's over? You got so many people laying out there, and they're going out there with wagons and with carts, and they're hauling off 2, 3, 4, 5 of them at a time. And they're driving past hundreds of people that are laying there. I read a book one time about Gettysburg, and it was, I think the title of it was The Largest Tragedy, or The Biggest Tragedy, something like that. And it was a doctor who was at Gettysburg. And, you know, the battle lasted a couple of days, and while the battle is going on, there are people laying out there on the field that were shot in the very opening of the battle and laid there for 4 days because there wasn't enough time for the surgeons to get out there and haul everybody off to help. Statistics tell us that more people died from infection and disease than actually died from being shot in the Civil War. And you think about that. Can you imagine day 2? And you're told to try and take a position and you're running by some of your fellow soldiers who are still laying out there. The effect of what would have happened after days of no water and the sun beating down on them, and how do you get out there and help them? Because anybody who goes out there to help them is going to get shot at. What an incredible picture of judgment he gives us here in Jeremiah. Go back to chapter 15, verse 2. And it shall come to pass, if they say unto thee, Whither shall we go forth? Then thou shalt tell them, Thus saith the Lord, such is for death to death, and such is for sword to sword, and such is for famine to famine, and such is for captivity to captivity. Now he warned them in chapter 15. He said, listen, I have 4 weapons that I'm going to use, and you have war and the sword, and we'll get into that a little bit more later, and you have death, you have famine. He doesn't mention two others that are mentioned in Revelation, pestilence and beasts, and we'll get to that here in a minute. He warned them what was going to happen, and then in chapter 16 he tells us how bad it's going to be, where the carcasses are just laying all over the place. Can you imagine what it is going to be like when we get to the Battle of Armageddon? When the blood is splashed up and flows to the bridles of the horses? And there are fowls of the air gathered from all over the place to sit there and who's going to bury everybody? What a mess. What a mess. We're not going to take the time to turn there. Ezekiel chapter 5, 11 through 17 does the same thing. It links together the fact that famine quite often, most often, follows war. But then he has this balances, and he talks about measuring out the wheat, and he talks about measuring out the barley, which suggests to us that there's rationing going on. The only reason you ration is because there's a lack of supply. I know most of you probably remember in the 80s the shortage of gasoline. I remember going down with my dad, you could only go on certain days and he could only get 5 gallons. My dad worked quite a ways from home. And the only way he could get back and forth to work is he had to drive one vehicle on certain days and he had to drive another vehicle on other days, or he didn't have enough gas to get back and forth to work and would have lost his job. And I'm thinking, man, this is crazy. It's crazy. The craziest thing about it is we have tons of oil underneath the United States and we could have been pumping it out of the ground. Man's reasoning. We're stupid. Boys didn't hear that. We are. We come up with some of the craziest things, and in the end, it really, really hurts us. And here we see, well, we're going to have this false peace that everybody's going to fall into, and when the peace falls apart, then you know what selfishness does. It starts fightings that come from within, and pretty soon there's war all over the place. And after the war, we have this famine, and basically what God says is, I decreed it and I allowed it to happen, but in a smaller sense, y'all did it to yourselves. Y'all did it to yourselves. I want you to see a verse in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 26. Because way, way back, when God's talking about the law, he gives us this verse and warns us the consequences. Leviticus 26:26 says, and when I have broken the staff of your bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in one oven. Now, why are 10 people baking in the same oven? I mean, obviously, you have a lack of either ovens or you have a lack of wood. And you have to fire the oven somehow. And can you imagine trying to scrape together enough necessities and you can start getting the oven hot, and then 10 people want to throw their stuff in there because everybody wants to bake bread before the oven gets cold. Well, what a situation you have. But notice, it's worse. And they shall deliver you your bread again by weight. And ye shall eat, and what? Notice the heavy rationing that's going on. All 10 people gather around the oven, everybody trying to cook their bread before the oven gets cold. And when they take the bread out, they break off a little bit for everybody that's there. And when it's all gone, you've had a little bit to eat, but you haven't had near enough because you're not satisfied. You're talking about serious starvation here. Ezekiel 4:16 talks about the same thing, measuring bread in time of need. Now, if you go back with me to Revelation chapter 6, you'll notice that 2 grains are mentioned. And it's kind of important. Actually, it's very important because it tells us how bad things are. You have a measure of wheat. Say, what's a measure of wheat? Well, first off, wheat is a choice grain. It's used in baking. It's used in baking all kinds of things. It was used in making other dishes too. You could mix wheat and different things together and make soups, and sometimes you use lentils for the same thing, but wheat is a choice grain. A measure, and the word here is chonics, basically it's equal to an English quart. So think about it. 1 quart of wheat is what he's talking about. can be purchased for a penny. That's what this proclamation is in verse 6. This voice that comes from the middle of the beast tells us this. A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. So what he's telling us here is, you have 1 English quart of wheat for a penny. Now, how much is a penny? Because that sounds pretty good. You used to go down to the store with $1 and buy a whole bunch. But wait a minute. In Matthew, I believe it's chapter 20, talks about a denarii, a penny being a day's wages. And that is the parable where Jesus said, a certain man had a vineyard, and he went early in the morning, and he told the men, will you work in my vineyard, and I'll give you a day's wages. And then he went down a couple hours later and hired some more, and a couple hours later and hired some more. And then about an hour before closing time, he went down and he hired some more. And when they all lined up, he gave every one of them a penny. And the guys who were paid last were the ones who were worked the longest, and they were upset. But the whole parable, the whole principle of the thing is, a penny was a day's wages. And they're saying, well, these fellows only worked an hour. Why are you giving them a whole day's wage? He gave them a denarii. This voice that comes from the middle of the beast says, you can buy a quart of wheat for an entire day's wages. Well, how much food can you make with a quart? Some people argue that this is 1 meal for 1 man for a day. That's how bad it is. Other people say this is enough sustenance for 1 man for 1 day. But let me ask you a question. If you go to work and your entire day's wages went to feed you, then what do you do about your family? And so if you're going to feed your family, you're obviously not eating wheat. So then let's talk about the barley. But before we do, let me give you an example of how bad things are. The normal rate would have been 8 to 12 measures of wheat for a penny. So we are talking about inflation that is at least 8 times its normal size and possibly 12 times its normal size. 3 measures of barley, it's a lesser grain, it wasn't nearly as valuable, and so you could eat barley, and we've talked about this before, a day's wages to feed 3 people on animal fodder for 1 day, because that's usually what you fed barley. You fed animals barley. They can digest it better and use it better. We can't digest it and use it as well. And so basically what he's saying here is, the folks that have families would work all day and they bring home enough to feed 3 people a lesser meal. And you can imagine what's going to happen over weeks and months. You're talking about starvation and malnutrition. Your body can't live on barley alone. We have also this proclamation, and you can pick up 40 different commentaries and probably get 10 different things about what this is, but this voice comes out and says, see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. And some people believe he's talking to the rider on the black horse. But I don't think he is, because I don't see the rider on the black horse really affecting anything. I just see that as he goes forth, you see famine start to spread across the land. But I don't see him attacking the wheat. I don't see him attacking the barley. All I see is this is a byproduct of the war that has broken out and the kind of conditions that men are living in. I believe what you have here is he's telling everybody you need to be really careful about using the wine and the oil. But what you need to know is oil and wine are luxury items. They're luxury items if they're rich in the time of a famine, because if you can't afford barley, you can't afford oil and wine. Oil and wine were used in medicine, and they were also used in cooking. If you wanted to fend off an infection, you'd often take olive oil and pour across it and try and keep the nastiness out. Now, you think what just happened with the red horse going, you could have had war break out all over the place. And now as this black horse comes forth, the voice says, you need to be careful about the oil and the wine, because you run out there and start pouring oil on everything. You're not going to have any oil for cooking, because things are going to get really, really, really bad. They're going to get really bad. We'll see that when the 4th horse comes out. Who is this voice that we hear in the midst of the 4 beasts? Well, if you go back and you remember in our description in chapter 4 of what's happening in and around and on the throne, you remember that the four beasts are constantly prancing around the throne. And you have one sitting in the midst of them who lives forever and ever, and that is God. So what's very interesting to me is you have one of the four beasts, as the seal is open, tells John to come and see. But here, for the first time, and we're going to see it later as we progress through Revelation, we have a voice that proceeds from the four beasts, and I believe it's God himself, because he wants man to know that this judgment comes from him. He controls it. He sits on the throne. And that's why chapter 4 and chapter 5 are so important to the whole rest of the book. Go to 1 Samuel chapter 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8. First Samuel chapter 8, the elders of Israel want to have a king. They are tired of what's going on. Starting in verse 4, then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Now remember, man's reasoning, right? It is the beast, we believe, is opening this thing, and you have this famine going forth. God says, give him a king, but you give him a warning first. Remember that this black horse is going forth, but this black horse is a direct result of the kings of the earth warring under the red horse. Look what he says, verse 8. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit, yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. And Samuel told all the words unto the people that asked of him a king. And he said, This will be a manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen. And some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands, and captains over 50s. And will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make him instruments of war, and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields, and your vineyards, and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants and your goodliest young men and your asses, and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants, and ye shall cry out in that day, because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you. And the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us. And now you go to Revelation chapter 6, and you see what the kings of the earth have been doing with the red horse. And God says, Here's my judgment. I warned you what a king would do to you. I warned you what putting your trust in the government would do to you. The taxes and the bondage and the servitude and all the problems that follow, and now my judgment has been turned loose. Back to Revelation chapter 6, the fourth horse. Things just keep getting worse and worse. Verse 7 and 8. And when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, Come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death. And hell followed with him, and power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. Powerful, powerful seal. The contemporary verses are Matthew 24:7 and verses 9 through 12. We have this pale horse, which stands for death. The fourth beast would be the eagle, and we said the eagle stands for power and speed. It's one of those majestic animals. When they wanted to pick a symbol for our country, Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey. Because it could see so well, and it could tell when the enemy was coming, and he thought that was the way we were, when we were throwing off the yoke from Great Britain. But then other people said, no, we want the eagle because he flies above everything that's happening down here, and he has a different perspective, and he moves with such majesty, and with such speed, and with such strength. And here we have death going forth with speed and with strength. What a shame that symbol is used in such a way. Pale, the word here, the Greek word is chloros. It's the same word we get chlorophyll, and it's only used 4 other times in the Bible. 3 of them refer to grass, and 1 of them is used again to refer, as it is here, to this sickly, pale, yellowish, green, ashen color. You probably know the color best if you've ever seen a corpse laying there draining blood. The symbol? The rider named Death. Now, isn't it interesting that we have never been given the name of a rider before? We've had 3 horses, and it just says, a horse went forth, and a rider sat on him. But this time, we have a rider named Death, but we have no other description. And what's interesting is the 2 are linked together because we have death, and it says Hades follows him. Hades is the place of the dead. In chapter 1, verse 18, they are paired together when Jesus is said to hold the keys of death and hell. Same word. And in chapter 20, verse 13 and 14, we got to turn there. Sometimes you just have to take your time. You aren't doing anything else tonight, are you? Chapter 20, verse 13 and 14. I'm telling you, I'm going to struggle when we get to this passage. The finality of this just sends chill bumps up my spine. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works. And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. When we tell somebody, listen, you have to choose between heaven or hell, technically it's true, but they're not going to spend eternity in hell, per se. They're going to spend eternity in the lake of fire, because death and hell get cast into the lake of fire. And that's the eternal abode. And so we see this link in the Bible where death and hell are linked together, and for an unbeliever, it's one of those things where it makes you draw a breath and stop for a minute, because there aren't any second chances. There's no hope anymore. Always in our life we think, well, there's no. Let me tell you why this is so significant. Because one claims the body, and the other claims the soul. One claims the body, and the other claims the soul. Can you imagine the picture of this horse going through with strength and speed like an eagle, and the finality of what is about to happen? He lists some weapons in verse 6, in chapter 6, that are very important, because throughout God's Word, He uses these together. He says, power was given unto them over the 4th part of the earth to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. Sword is war, famine we've already talked about. Pestilence is the Greek word thanatos. It can be disease, it can be natural disasters, but it is a strong word. That's why when they made the movie, they called that guy Thanos. I'm going to click my fingers and half the people are going to croak. Comes from this Greek word. Beasts could be dangerous beasts, but it also could be rats, and it could be mosquitoes. You think of the bubonic plague was spread by what? Fierce lions running through Europe? No. Rats and mice. Nasty. Think about all of the warmer climate countries and malaria and all the diseases that are spread down there. Folks, can you imagine the disease that run rampant when this horse is turned loose because of the famine and the war that has happened? If you have bodies laying all over the ground and you have so many that they can't even hardly bury them, imagine the disease that starts spreading through the rats and the mosquitoes and everything else that's out there gnawing on them. What an incredible, incredible statement of yuck. Go with me real quickly into 1 Chronicles chapter 21. God uses these weapons together. In 1 Chronicles chapter 21, starting in verse 10, David has transgressed against the Lord. And Gad is going to come to him, and he is going to give him what seems like an impossible choice. Listen to his choice. Go and tell David, saying, Thus saith the Lord, I offer thee 3 things. Choose thee one of them, that I may do it unto thee. I just got to stop for a minute and tell you. I'd be at my grandfather's, and I did something I wasn't supposed to, and he'd look at me and he'd say, go get a switch off the willow tree. And my mom's rule was, if it breaks, I'm going back to get me a switch, and we're doing this again. So don't go getting, you could get one of those end little things, were little wispy things. You know what I hated most? It wasn't the fact of getting whooped with that switch. It was having to walk out to that tree and pick it myself. And can you imagine David here? God says, I'm going to give you a choice of 3 things, and you get to pick, David. Now, you're king over the people. So whichever 3 things happen, you have to stand there and watch God judge the people for something you did. I cannot imagine how much it hurt his heart. That's exactly what's happening here. Look at his choices in verse 12. Either 3 years famine, or 3 months to be destroyed before thy foes, while the sword of thine enemies overtake thee, or else 3 days the sword of the Lord, even the pestilence in the land, and the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the coasts of Israel. 3 years of famine, 3 months, your foes are just going to rage war with you, and there's nothing you can do about it, because they're going to kick your hind end up one side and down the other. Or 3 days, the angel of the Lord is going to go through the people hacking and whacking. What's it going to be? And David said unto Gad, I am in a great strait. Yes, you are, buddy. Let me fall now into the hand of the Lord, for very great are his mercies, but let me not fall into the hand of man. So the Lord sent pestilence upon Israel. Now hold on there for just a second. Do you see what he says? I don't want to be judged by man. I want to be judged by God. Because I know he's going to be harsh, but he's also going to be merciful. Now let's read the last part of that verse and think about this, because this is God being what? Merciful. And there fell of Israel 70,000 men. You say, oh my goodness, that's mercy? You better believe it's mercy. It's mercy. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Verse 9. Nation of Israel understood this picture very well. Listen to what they say. If, when evil cometh upon us, as the sword, judgment, or pestilence, or famine, we stand before this house and in thy presence, for thy name is in this house, and cry unto thee in our affliction, then thou wilt hear and help. What were they saying? God judges us with these things. And if we stand before this house and we repent and we cry unto him, then he is going to stop those 4 things from happening. Now, go to Jeremiah chapter 14, verse 12. When they fast, I will not hear their cry. And when they offer burnt offering and an oblation, I will not accept them. But I will consume them by the sword and by the famine and by the pestilence. See how he links them together. He does the same thing. We're not going to, for sake of time, turn there, but chapter 24:10, God says the same thing. I'm going to bring these things upon you. In chapter 44, verses 9 through 13, he tells them, this is one last opportunity to repent, or guess what? I'm going to bring you the sword, and I'm going to bring you famine, and I'm going to bring you pestilence, and I'm going to bring you wild beasts. So as we close tonight, go back to Revelation chapter 6, verse 8. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth. I looked it up this afternoon. If Jesus Christ came back tonight and ushered in the start of the tribulation period, best guess there are 7.7 billion people alive as of November 2019, this month. 7.7 billion. And when death rides forth on that sickly green-looking horse, and death follows after, 1.925 billion people die. Just under 2 billion people. And God says in Jeremiah, there will be such great slaughter that the bodies will lay about like dung on the earth, with no one to bury them. You know why nobody will bury them? Because there is such famine and pestilence, you wouldn't want to touch a dead body for anything. You're trying to do everything you can just to stay alive. You won't care about relatives. You won't care about anything else but keeping yourself alive. 4 horsemen. This is the start, folks. This is the start. We haven't even opened the 5th seal. False peace leads to war. War leads to famine. Famine leads to death. And God says, you chose the governments of the world and rejected me. And 2 billion people are going to reap the consequences. And listen, folks, if the rapture happens and the Christians are gone, how many folks are running around the world spreading the gospel at this point? And if we're gone, where's the influence of the Holy Spirit? You are talking about billions of people who lose their body and who lose their soul because they rejected. Worthy is the Lamb that was slain. Let's bow for prayer. Father, one of the most chilling verses in your word is that every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that you are Lord. But that happens for many right before you say, depart from me, I never knew you. And they are cast into outer darkness, where the smoke